Hi there, everybody. This is the Renegade Historian, and I hope you're all staying safe and warm tonight. How much would you pay for a flower? My guess is no more than a couple of dollars, even for a really fancy one. But there was once a time where you could buy a house with a flower that didn't even exist yet. As it turns out, meme stonks aren't anything new. We've been making the market behave irrationally since before there was a market. And it all started in a pleasant little country filled with tulips and canals. This is the story of Tulip Mania, the world's first financial bubble. Back in the 17th century, a newly independent Netherlands was Europe's fastest up-and-coming power. The country is small, but very clever, and the Dutch have always known how to use their resources effectively. They did create new land out of nothing, after all. Among the many innovations created by the Dutch, the one with the greatest reach was modern financial markets. The Netherlands was home to the world's first stock market, its first publicly listed company, and not to mention the world's first market bubble and crash. Today, stock markets in New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Berlin all trace their lineage back to the first one in Amsterdam. The growing wealth of the Netherlands spurred the growth of the middle class. These merchants, tradesmen, and artisans had something few aside from the nobility had ever had before: disposable income. And they were eager to show off their newfound wealth. But in a world without Bugattis or McMansions for the nouveau riche to flex on their neighbors with, they turned to a recent import from Turkey: tulips. The flowers were originally from Central Asia and traveled from Iran into the Ottoman Empire, and from there to the west via the Holy Roman Empire's ambassador in Constantinople. Once the botanist Carolus Clusius figured out that tulips could be grown in the much colder and harsher climates of northern Europe, they became the latest fad, and the Dutch went nuts for them. Across the Netherlands, many people took up tulip growing as a hobby, cultivating new and interesting varieties of the flower. It could also generate a nice chunk of extra income on the side. The more exotic the tulip, the more valuable it was. Among the most prized tulips were those infected with the tulip-breaking virus, which caused the petals to have streaks of a different color, which in some cases made it appear as if it were on fire. Their names were pretty wild, too. The most expensive one of the day was called Semper Augustus, but some had names derived from famous historical figures like Alexander the Great. The prefix general or admiral was often used to emphasize quality. Sometimes they doubled up, calling flowers general of generals or admiral of admirals. Even more wild than their names were the prices, which grew sharply from the 1620s onward. A single bulb of Semper Augustus cost 1,000 guilders by 1623, but by 1625 it was worth 3,000 guilders. That's 10 times the annual wages of a skilled craftsman in 17th century Holland. When tulip mania really took hold, many tulip bulbs traded for between $50,000 and $150,000 in today's money. The most valuable ones could top $750,000 in value. Imagine buying a house or a Ferrari for a tulip. At the height of the tulip bubble, some tulips sold for as much as 10,000 guilders, which would buy you a mansion on Amsterdam's Grand Canal. And if you've never seen these houses, they are big and they are gorgeous. I highly recommend a trip to Amsterdam if you have the chance. It's a beautiful city, and the people are super friendly. Tulip growers who produce new kinds of flowers would protect them through contracts, but it usually didn't work, and people would reproduce the most spectacular tulips anyway. The money was just too damn good. These hobbyists would meet up at pubs that they called colleges and trade their tulip bulbs. The thing is, cultivating tulips can take 7 to 12 years. In the Northern Hemisphere, tulips bloom for 1 week, in April and May. During their dormant stage from June to September, tulips can be moved, so that's when the trading happened. During the rest of the year, they traded using a primitive form of a futures contract, or an agreement to buy a given good at a specified price on a certain date. But when people saw the extra income these tulip growers were bringing in, they wanted a piece, even if they didn't know fuck all about tulips. They started going to the colleges and buying tulips and tulip contracts. By 1634, demand in France caused even more speculators and traders to get into the market. As they did, demand soared, and so did tulip price. Higher demand for the same number of goods means the price of those goods went up. As interest increased, a formal futures market was instituted. Traders never had to handle a single tulip bulb or even know what a tulip looked like to make money off of them. The futures contracts were agreements to buy tulips at the end of the season. But you never actually had to execute that contract. You could just sell it before it became due, and new tulip traders could buy in pretty cheap. They only had to pay a 2.5% fee called wine money, which was up to a maximum of 3 guilders per trade. The Dutch took to calling the tulip market windhandel or wind trade, because no tulip bulbs were actually being bought or sold, just contracts to buy or sell tulip bulbs sitting in the ground at some point in the future. Tulips became a major part of the Dutch economy. Its fourth largest export, in fact, behind gin, herring, and cheese. And, by the way, if you do go to Amsterdam, try the pickled herring. I know it sounds gross, but it's actually delicious, especially with pickles. Anyway, at the peak of the tulip trade, contracts were changing hands 10 times in a single day. Fortunes were made and lost overnight, but what goes up must come back down. This sort of speculation is entirely unsustainable. It's never good when the market skyrockets seemingly on its own. That means it might be becoming detached from the underlying economy it's operating on. In February 1637, at a bulb auction in Haarlem, nobody showed up, which could have been due to a recent outbreak of the plague, though that may have also contributed to the stomach for risk the Dutch had developed. Why not bet your savings if dying tomorrow was a distinct possibility? Anyway, those who did show up at the Haarlem auction refused to buy anything, and the prices collapsed. The people holding bulbs and contracts rushed to sell, causing the price of tulip bulbs to crash dramatically. Prices peaked on February 3rd, 1637, and by May 1st, 1637, tulip prices had come back down to earth. The world's first financial bubble had popped. But it didn't actually do that much damage to the prosperity of the Netherlands, which would grow into a global superpower in its own right over the next 2 centuries. Tulip traders were still an extreme minority in the Dutch population, a small part of the emerging middle class. Still, it has a lasting cultural legacy in the Netherlands and serves as the prime example of a speculative bubble even today. The dot-com boom and Bitcoin's rise and fall in 2017 are 2 modern examples of the exact same phenomenon. And it serves as a good reminder of one of my favorite investing phrases: the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. That's all for me. This is Renegade Historian, signing off. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.